Welcome back to the Fabulous Four podcast. I'm Double G alongside Duan. How's it going, Duan?
Hi, GG. I think the episode we're going to do tonight is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the others, simply because there isn't quite as much fight to talk about. But this is the one and only kind of true wipeout in the whole series. But with that, there's still a lot that goes into the story. We talked about it last time with Duran earning another big shot with his plucky effort against Hagler. Well, 7 months later, after a fair amount of drinking and partying, he would get that opportunity, and it would come against Thomas Hearns. And what Duran was doing effectively was going from fighting the best 160-pounder in the world to fighting the best 154-pounder in the world in consecutive fights. So it was always going to be a tough ask, but I think especially with somebody with the physical attributes that Hearns had, I think he was just all wrong for Duran. And unfortunately for Roberto, he came up against a version of the Hitman on this night that was just in blistering form.
Maybe the best version ever of the Hitman.
I believe Manny Stewart thinks that to be the case.
So just to get a little bit of information out to the listeners, you can actually, there's a page on the website on Fight Game Blog where you can go to a tab and you can find all of the Fabulous Four podcasts in order with the supplementary materials that we are writing about and posting about as well. So that's kind of your one-stop shop if you want to go and check out the podcast, and you can listen to them in order and all that. So all that being said, let's move on. And what I want to do before we actually get to Duran and Hearns is I kind of want to do a roll call with the other two guys in our series, because they're always linked, Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard. And, in a couple podcasts, we'll get to their fight. But the lay of the land, as it seems to me in, 1984, is that Marvin Hagler wants Ray Leonard. Thomas Hearns wants Ray Leonard. And they both see that fight as the big fight. I think even going back to this time, maybe even a year or two earlier, Hearns was saying that, the only way that he could get back to Ray Leonard is to go up and beat Marvin Hagler, because then that will be something that, that Sugar Ray had never done before, and then that would create a lot of interest in a second fight with Leonard. And at that time, and this was before Leonard had hurt his eye, which we'll talk about, Leonard was basically playing with Tommy and saying stuff like, well, I'll give Tommy the next fight, but only if he agrees that he was done at the end of the 14th round in our fight, because he says that it shouldn't have been stopped. And so Leonard's playing games, but I think Leonard believes at that point that eventually he's going to take on Tommy again. I don't know if he feels that he's eventually going to take on Hearns Hagler at that point, but if we go back a little bit to 82, so this is right after. This is right after he beats Tommy Hearns in February of '82. He faces Bruce Finch and puts him away pretty quickly, but he's starting to have eye trouble, and it causes him to take a couple years off, and actually. There was it was Leonard essentially calling, for retirement, and we talked about that in the last episode with him kind of leaving Hagler hanging there. And, he has a surgery on his eye. Sugar Ray Leonard probably has enough money to live for the rest of his life, doesn't really need to fight again, but, he does decide to come back, and in December of '83, he creates a plan of attack, and here are the fights that he wants to have. Milton McCrory and Donald Curry, and then Duran again, and then Hearns again, and then finally the build up to Hagler. So even then, at this point in 1983, if Leonard fights, I don't know, once or maybe twice a year, we're still years away from his overall plan in fighting Marvin Hagler. The problem with this is that Leonard's eye was still messed up. And so when he actually has the fight with Kevin Howard in February of '84, it was scheduled and they had to push it back, so it gets pushed back to May. And so
it was a second eye injury that had it rescheduled. He obviously, coming off the detached retina that he had, they were being extra vigilant with his medical, and they came across an existing other injury with the eye, and that's what postponed the fight. And I guess the doctor at the time jumped the gun a little bit and told the press straight away that Leonard should never fight again after that injury. And when they did eventually get him back on the road for that Howard fight, they brought out that doctor and kind of had him go back on the statement and say, oh, well, what I meant was that nobody should really box, but Ray isn't at any more danger than anybody else is. So, it was looking very much like retirement was on the cards at that point. But, initially, before that, they've been targeting a guy called, an Irish fighter called Sean Mannion. And the reason they were doing that was because he was a lefty, and that was obviously to lead to a Hagler fight. And when Mannion was, the Top Rank pressured Mannion to not sign with to fight Leonard because Leonard's people didn't want any promoters involved, and they pressured him to fight Mike McCallum instead. And when he took that fight with McCallum, that's when they looked at Kevin Howard, who was a Philadelphia fighter, and he was also a left-handed fighter. So they were again looking for somebody that would in some way replicate what Marvin Hagler did as a long-term game plan.
And so Howard actually knocks Leonard down in the fight. Leonard does come back to win in the 9th round. He's ahead on all the scorecards at the time of the stoppage. But at the post-fight presser, Leonard, maybe in a bit of frustration, just from a performance perspective, announces his retirement again. So this is May 11th, 1984, and this is a couple of months before actual Hearns and Duran. So at the point of the Hearns and Duran fight, Sugar Ray Leonard is again retired.
And Marvin had once again come along to that fight with Howard, expecting at the post-fight conference to be called out by Ray. And again, he got greeted with another Ray retirement announcement. So it's just Marvin just been strung along again. But I just wanted to quote what Leonard said at the time at that conference. He said, "I knew it wasn't there, and that's when I decided it was time to retire for good. If I didn't feel it tonight, I never will. There's no sense in going on." So in his mind, it sounded like it was quite a definite retirement at that point for him. And this would be 3 years out of the sport. It was a long road back for him to come back after this one.
And so, if we look at Marvin Hagler at this point in time, so he beats an inspired Roberto Duran, like we talked about in the last podcast. He takes a bit of heat for the performance because it's a smaller man coming up to his weight class. It's a man who had been sort of left for dead in a sense, and Hagler is the so-called most fierce and respected guy in the weight class or in the smaller weight classes. And so I think there was a bit of a pressure on him to actually put on a great performance. And, it obviously doesn't work when the other guy is having a hell of a fight himself. So Hagler has to sort of rebound from this. And right before, a few months before this Hearns and Duran fight, he takes on Juan Roldan, knocks him out in the 10th round. And that is the only fight he will have until after they set up, they're sort of setting up what is going to be the next fight for next big fight, Hagler Hearns. He does have one more title defense in between there against the guy that he'd already beat before in Mustafa Hamsho. So
just to finish off on that Roldan fight, Roldan had been hanging around as Hagler's mandatory for ages at that point. He'd been paid step-side money like 4 times and put on Hagler's various undercards just because there wasn't any money in a fight with him for Hagler. And when he did take that fight, he actually knocked Marvin down in the first round. Marvin disputes it, but that is the one time Hagler was down in his career. And I guess if you're looking at that, it wasn't an astonishing performance against Rodan, and that's coming off after what people thought was a pretty disappointing performance against Duran. Marvin's kind of, he's got his back to the wall a little bit. He needs to come up with something big at that point.
So tell us about where Roberto Duran stands here after his great fight against Hagler. He immediately targets. He either targets or is targeted as the next big fight with Tommy Hearns. So what happens to Duran between the Hagler and the Hearns fight?
Well, if we pick up where we left off last time, but Duran's got a ton of cash after his big payday with Hagler, and what would you do in that case if you were Roberto Duran, GG? You might hire an entire orchestra and go on tour with them. Well, that's what he did, and he went around touring Central America, and his entourage swelled up again, as we kind of been the story of Roberto's career. After he had one of these impressive performances, he kind of went a little off the rails, and he put on a ton of weight. He got his weight up to, I think, 196 pounds or something like that. And he burned through most of his money he'd made in the fight. And, it came time to go back to boxing and earn another payday. And at that time, he still had his WBA junior middleweight title that he'd won from Davey Moore, because the Hagler fight was up a middleweight, of course. And, but having that fight with Hagler meant that he hadn't defended his title in probably close on a year at this point, and the WBA was starting to pressure him to go in against Mike McCallum, who was one of the real rising stars, and another one of the kind of interesting peripheral characters we come across in this series. And Duran's people didn't really want to do the fight with McCallum just because there wasn't really any money in it for him. Stewart managed both Hearns and McCallum, and I think what he was told essentially was, look, we're not fighting McCallum. We'll shoot for a fight with a rematch with Hagler instead, and make 10 times as much money if that's what's going to be enforced upon us, and just drop the belt. And at that point, Hearns or Stewart started negotiating for a shot for Tommy instead, with McCallum going on the undercard. They would have Roberto drop the WBA title, and it would just be for the WBC title that Tommy held, and McCallum would fight on the undercard against Sean Mannion for the WBA belt. That fight didn't actually go ahead on the undercard, because I think McCallum was a little bit frustrated that Tommy was getting in ahead of him, and I think that's kind of sort of damaged his relationship a little bit with the Kronk guys. But he did end up fighting Mannion and winning that title. But I think it was on a separate show, and the purse bid was really small. I think it was like 75 grand or something like that. So there wasn't a lot of money in that. But they did instead move forward with that Hearns Duran fight, and initially it was scheduled to be in Barbados or Bahamas, and they both went off to start their training camps there. And as I said, Roberto was really heavy, and reportedly he was sick during camp. He had been drinking a lot. He was throwing up. And even by his own admission, I think he said he trained 3 weeks in total for the Hearns fight. He did 2 weeks in Bahamas, and then he did a 1 week in Hollywood. But what happened with the Bahamas fight was, basically, they were relying on some local financing for that, and it just wasn't coming through. And Caesars had built a custom-built arena for a Larry Holmes fight, a title unification bout. That was falling out of bed at the same time, so it made sense for them to just migrate Hearns Duran to Caesars. The only problem was it was a huge 25,000 stadium, and they really didn't have that type of interest in a Hearns Duran fight at that time. I think, they ended up taking in 14,000 sold tickets, 14,824, I think the number was. And, the promoter lost some like 3 million on the promotion. It was the guy who would, I think his name was Steve Taub. He would been, a car dealer or something like that. He had made millions. And I think he called this fight his most expensive 6 minutes of his entire life. But he lost a fortune on it. I think Hearns had a guarantee of 1.8. Duran had a guarantee of 1.6. And Stewart was actually at one point going to pull Tommy out of the fight just because he didn't think the money was going to be there for the fighters after all the losses. But what actually happened to Caesars came and saved the day by saying they would guarantee the paydays for the fighters ahead of the bill. So that's the only thing that kind of kept this card together.
So where we are with Hearns is that, and I want to go back a couple of years because I think we're going to talk about one fight just quickly because we've written about it on the website and I think it deserves a little bit of coverage here. Just to explain how good Tommy Hearns was at this time, because I think he's maybe I don't know if he's the fourth most famous or the fourth most renowned, but Sugar Ray Leonard obviously, and there's just a lot of mystique about Roberto Duran and just the way that Hagler retired and walked away. Tommy Hearns, I think, maybe a little bit overshadowed, but just to show you where he was and how good he was right around this time, I'm going to bring up a guy's name by the name of Marcos Giraldo. And in 1982, Hearns had fought him, knocked him out in the first round. And the reason why I bring him up is because Hagler and Leonard had also both faced Giraldo earlier in his career, and they were not able to put him away. And they both won, and they both won decisively. But even Sugar Ray had mentioned how tough of a fight that was for him, and it just goes to show you that a lot of these guys Hearns was able to put away. And he was a really scary fighter because of his height, because of his range, the jab, the right hand. And as we lead up to this fight, he had broken the hand against, I believe it was against Wilfred Benitez. And there was a little bit of a worry that he was not able to put away some guys. I think his 3 fights previous to Duran were all decisions. There was a 12-rounder, there was a 10-rounder, and then when he beat Benitez for the light middleweight title. And there was a worry that he, because of the injury, and which also caused a delay in the first originally when Hearns and Hagler were supposed to get it on. There was a worry that maybe he had lost some power in that right hand. So there was a little bit of not that he needed to look fantastic in this fight against Duran, but I think he would have probably faced a similar backlash as Hagler did if he didn't put Duran out. And so, there was some pressure on him to get back to being the hitman. And as you wrote up in the write-up that we put up on the website, they announced him at this fight, as once again the hitman after the Motor City Cobra. So, I just wanted to just lead into this fight with the idea that, hey, Tommy Hearns was really great. And he, at this point in time, coming up to this fight with Duran, I don't remember what it was like. I was a really young child at this point, and I wasn't, watching all of the boxing. But, Hagler's a bad man. Duran is probably a little bit past his prime at this point. Sugar Ray Leonard is retired. But Thomas Hearns is absolutely one of the scariest guys in boxing at this moment. Yeah, well,
he did go through kind of, as you said, a part of his career where, he wasn't really the puncher for those fights at post-Leonard. In his first 32 fights, he had 30 KOs, and then that's leading up to the Leonard fight. And in the 7 between Leonard and Duran, he only had two stoppages. And obviously, as you said, the last 3 were all decisions. And, Stewart had said that he wasn't even really throwing throwing the right hand hard and sparring in those two previous fights after he came back from the broken hand. So he had stopped using the Hitman name. He'd started using the Motor City Cobra, and I think a lot of people. There's not that much said about this period, but I think he was said to be quite reclusive at the time, and he really wasn't finding things that easy. But I guess possibly what helped him turn the corner is that he's going into this fight. He just had this really good camp around him. Manny had started working with the US Olympic hopefuls, and Hearns was sparring daily with Mark Breland, Frank Tate. He did some with Pernell Whitaker.
Can you imagine watching him and Whitaker spar?
Yeah, I think people were joking a bit at the time that Tommy was getting tooled in a lot of these sparring sessions by these guys because they were so young and hungry. But Manny knew that the key to beating Duran was going to be to really emphasize his pace or his speed, and he was super sharp in this. Those after dealing with Breland for weeks on end, and then having to fight Roberto, Roberto was like a sitting duck. And also as well as that, they had Mike McCallum and Milton McCrory in the gym, and a lot of people say those Hearns McCallum sparring sessions were just legendary. They're some of the best fights at the Kronk. Some of the best fights that would happen all year would be behind closed doors with those two. So, I think that kind of reinstated his confidence. And, as he said, he did announce himself again as the hitman going into this fight. Duran's people actually wanted 10-ounce gloves for this fight. It was regulated that they should be 8-ounce gloves, and the commission stuck with 8-ounce. And both Stewart and Hearns were like, no, they're the gloves we want. We want the puncher's gloves. So they fancied the knockout. Tommy predicted a round 2 stoppage. And, for Tommy, he's had hand injuries, you might think he would be the guy who would be looking for the heavier gloves. But, he really fancied this job. And because he knew that, this was the bridge for him to a Marvin Hagler fight. But to get that fight, he had to do what Hagler didn't do and take Duran out and do it well.
Mark Breland, by the way, my favorite USA or my favorite Olympic boxer of all time. For some reason, those 84 Olympics, he's the one that I latched onto. Even though I did enjoy watching Whitaker and Holyfield, but he's the one who I latched onto, and it broke my heart that he didn't actually become the star that I had sort of pegged him when I was 8 years old. So leading into this camp, you mentioned you mentioned Hearns just having an exquisite camp, and we talked about earlier how Duran just had a terrible camp. So you have this contrasting of guys coming into this fight, and so as these guys step into the ring, what's the expectation from the boxing world at this point? Is it that Hearns is just too big, too fast, too young, and he's going to take care of business? Or was there still that mystique that Roberto Duran was going to somehow make Tommy Hearns' life miserable?
Yeah, I think, Hearns was a favourite. Not a really strong favourite, but a bit of a favourite. But I think a lot of people reckoned Duran was going to give him a really tough fight. It was, the odds were on this being a distance fight. I talked about how Tommy hadn't really been knocking too many guys out in the lead up to it. Duran had, only 2 knockouts in his previous 10, which goes back as far as the first Leonard fight. And those 2 knockouts were obviously the Cuevas and Moore ones we talked about last time. All his other fights had been the distance. So neither of the guys were putting people away. So I think most people were expecting a distance fight. But as you said, Tommy was raring to go. He was in top quality shape. Manny Stewart just thought this was the best Tommy Hearns could ever be. And on the flip side, Duran was, he had a terrible camp. He didn't really take it seriously. And, he had to get all that weight off. He was still 6 pounds over when he arrived in Vegas. he was running and he was in the sauna before going to the scales, and he just wasn't properly prepared for it. And I think you can kind of see that a little bit in him in the ring. There's this thing with Roberto Duran. In any of the fights where he was underprepared, you could kind of see it in him. There was just kind of a listless nature about him in the ring. He didn't have the same menace he had. You didn't see him getting up in Hearns' face. It was kind of a little withdrawn and within himself. And Tommy, on the other hand, you could see was, ready to go, and he had a job to do.
So a couple of things, just a couple of notes before the fight in of itself. So both fighters guaranteed $1.85 million, so a little bit lower than what we had seen previously from some of the bigger fights that the Fabulous Ford had prior, and pay-per-view and closed circuit. I don't gather that it was that successful, and what we're still talking about the pay-per-view business being early on. It was available on up to 2.1 million homes, though I don't have a number as far as actually how many people did buy it. And then closed circuit, it was available in over 200 locations. But the what's interesting is the video that I saw was of a CBS telecast. So I'm guessing this would have been probably a week later. And it's just amazing how, and it's very similar to how HBO does things these days, where they show a big fight a week later, and it's already known sort of what had happened, and so you set up sort of okay, we're going to show you the fight, and then we're going to talk about the next one. So that's sort of the video that I saw, the Brent Musburger hosting the CBS version. So we go into this fight, you see the tail of the tape. And I think Hearns' reach is something like 11 inches more than Duran's. He's quite a bit taller. Hearns looks menacing. And Duran, who usually was the one to have that look on his face, like you mentioned, it's just not there. You can sort of tell that he's not super confident as he walks into this fight. So
there was also a belief that maybe, because Duran wasn't his normal menacing self, there was kind of a belief that maybe Hearns was somebody who intimidated him. There's various stories over time of how Hearns kind of pushed him about and bullied him a little bit in the lead up to the fight, and Duran just really didn't retaliate. I think Tommy pulled his hat down over his eyes or something, and Duran just kind of shrugged and walked off. And the general consensus was that he was just always a little bit, for whatever reason, he was always a little bit put off by Hearns. He'd never tried kind of getting his head the way he did with Hagler and Leonard. So I don't know whether that was something or not, or whether it was just a matter of him not being 100% prepared for this fight. But, he wasn't the Roberto Duran we were used to seeing.
So this fight is all of a round and 30 seconds or so, or I don't remember how far the second round went, but so we can kind of talk about it in full. The first round, what did you see early on? Because I saw something that had I been watching in live and been a little bit older and sort of understood the game, that would have made me a little worried immediately as a Roberto Duran fan, and that was how easily Hearns was able to fake his jab and basically make Duran jump out of the way.
Yeah, I think there was two big game plan points for Hearns in this one that Stewart came up with, and one of them was to bully the bully. Manny always likes to do that. He mentioned again about how he had Lewis fight Tyson, came in, did the same thing, tried to take the play away from him, and don't let the bully get into his bullying mode. And the second one was to jab to the body to take the hands down. And Roberto followed those jabs every time. Hearns would throw the decoy with the jab, and he'd come through with the right hand, and Roberto would just walk straight into it. And that was kind of, I think, initially he got off to a little bit of quite a patient, measured start for a fight that unfolds the way it does. Hearns is quite subdued early. He's just pawing away with his jab, like trying to get Roberto to buy the feints. But once he finds that first right hand, he just goes straight to town on them after that. He's just measuring Roberto for time and time again. And then, you know, he catches him with an uppercut that cuts him, and it clearly throws Duran a little bit. And after that, I think it's just pretty much one-way traffic. He walks him onto one big shot that just crumples them and puts them down for the first time. And Roberto gets back up to his feet, and you can see his legs aren't that steady underneath him. And Hearns attacks him again, puts him against the ropes, and he's bashing away at him. And, you know, I think nowadays, probably a lot of refs would have stepped in right there with him still on his feet. But he takes a second count, and he gets up just as the bell rings, and he goes back to the corner. It's not his corner. His team come over and grab him and bring him back to the right corner. You could tell at that point Roberto's just in a world of trouble.
Yeah, and you sort of talked about it. I think the thing that I was so impressed with is when Hearns has him in trouble, he doesn't just go for the kill in an irresponsible way. Like, he keeps his distance and is just lining up his punches. And so, you know, Duran is trying to, he's trying to cover up. He's trying to draw Hearns in. He's trying to tie him up. And Hearns is like, I see what you're trying to do, but there's going to be none of that. And he just stays away. He knows exactly where the distance is. And Duran is just trying, you know, Duran is wobbly, and he's frustrated, and he's dizzy. And Hearns is he just knows. He's like, okay, like, I'm eventually going to get this guy. I don't have to take chances. But also, when he gets Duran against the ropes, just the lightning fast combinations, just I was just, wow. Like, that Tommy Hearns is the one that, you know, that everybody should remember from this first round. Just an amazing performance. Yeah,
and, you know, he's every bit as quick, if not quicker, than he was in that Leonard fight. And, you know, he looked absolutely incredible. He looked like he was in a different league to anybody else in the sport when you watch that back at that time, the way he was just handling Duran. And, you know, Duran, to his credit, showed a ton of guts in this. Like, I think anyone who kind of wrote Duran off as a quitter after no mask, like, there was no way this fight was ending any other way than with Roberto knocked out. But, you know, when Spada was trying to stop this fight in the corner after that first, Duran would hear none of it. And straight away he came out for the second. He tried to take the fight to Hearns. He knew he was in trouble, and he did what he could to try and make it a rough fight, and, you know, tried to close the distance and unleash some shots. But unfortunately, Tommy was just too much to overcome with the size difference. And once he stepped back and got the measure of him again and started to line him up for those right hands, he really put a beating on him. And I think probably Duran should have been saved from that last shot. It was just a tremendous right hand. You know, he is the same thing again as the first knockdown, where Tommy put the jab forward and Roberto's eyes followed it, and he didn't see the punch coming. He fell forward flat on his face, and as soon as he did, his corner spilled into the ring. The referee called it without a count. I would say that was probably the best punch of Tommy Hearns' career. I know Tommy thinks that the one he hit Cuevas with was better. I disagree with him on that. I think that was, to knock Roberto Duran out. And yeah, this is something you have to remember about this. Duran is in his entire career, right? This was the only clear knockout. I think he fought like 119 times or something like that. He had another stoppage loss really late against William Joppy, like late in his career. That was like late 90s when he had no business fighting a guy of Joppy's level, but Joppy never had him on the floor in that fight. The ref just stopped him standing. This was the one time he actually got put out by somebody. And, you know, that kind of shows you know, 7 months earlier, Marvin Hagler went to hell and back with this guy, and then Tommy Hearns just blasted through him in, you know, a matter of minutes.
So what do you think of Marvin Hagler's statement after this fight, which was he took everything out of Duran, and so all that was left with Tommy was like a shell of a fighter.
Yeah, I don't agree with that necessarily, and I don't think Marvin, now looking back on it in retrospect, would agree with him himself. I think he said since then that the only reason Duran had such that Hearns had such an easy time with Duran was because Roberto made a mess of the weight, and that's obviously what Roberto says as well, that it was the weight that killed him, because Roberto, even though after this fight his best days were behind him, he did still have a good win or two after this. He got that middleweight title win over Iran Barkley after Barkley had sparked out Hearns in a big upset. So he still had some good nights left in him, and I don't think I think if there was something to be taken from Duran in this fight, I think it was probably more the lifestyle he led in that 7 months between the two fights, rather than him having been beaten down by the Hagler bout. And also maybe there is something to that taking those two fights back to back were just too big an ask. That was a very tough 15-rounder. Maybe he should have had a tune-up fight or two, but to get his wheels back under him and get his confidence back up.
So we're gonna say goodbye to Duran for a little while here, but the thing that I wanted to kind of end on Duran here until then is the idea that after the No Mas fight and after his career had taken a turn for the downward, there was a lot of frustration from him and from the wife and from his handlers, as far as where does he go from here? His home country is so frustrated with him, and they think of him more as a quitter than as a great champion. And he redeemed himself by winning the title and then getting the Hagler fight and going pretty much toe to toe with at that point the baddest man in the game. And so he had redeemed himself in everybody's eyes. And after this fight, I think the worry for Duran a little bit was like, okay, now what's going to happen next? And I'll sort of leave this to you to kind of to tell what happened. But it feels like to me that because of the way he went out against Tommy Hearns, the frustration wasn't as much as the previous time.
No, I don't think it was at all. I think a lot of people respected the display he had, and I think, they also saw it as just Duran had nothing left. That was how they read it. I think he did actually originally retire after getting stopped. He retired immediately in the post-fight. He flew back to Panama and he ended up getting arrested. I don't know. He wasn't charged. He was let out the next day. I don't know. Maybe somebody would have, somebody in the police force or something said something that he didn't particularly like about how the fight went, and he got in a bit of a scuffle and he got thrown in the cell overnight or something like that. Nobody really knows the full details of that, but he was allowed back out the next day, and he was back in boxing before too long again.
So. After this fight, Tommy Hearns, he wants Hagler. I think in the post-fight interview, he said something to the fact that Hagler was shaking like a leaf on a tree. And in the CBS interview, which I'm assuming was a week later, I don't know exactly the time frame, but they kind of joked about it, and Hagler made a big joke about shaking like a leaf on a tree. And so, they're setting up Hagler and Hearns. What did you think of sort of the post-fight and then the back and forth between Hagler and Hearns on this CBS show, which I'm assuming was watched by a large amount of sports fans?
Yeah, I think the way Kimball put it at the time, he said, was like the only question was when, where, and how much, and that really was it. This seemed like, looking at it back at it in retrospect, it seems like just the biggest fight that could be possibly out there. You have a guy at Tommy who just looks in red hot form, and that was a scary display. I think, if you could jump back to the 16th of June 84, I think most people probably at that point looked at Tommy as the guy to beat. Hagler had those two, no, I'm not going to say bad performances, but underwhelming performances. And, Leonard had, the first time barely got by Tommy. Tommy's now 25 years old. He's in the form of his life and he's looking scary. And, that's how quickly things can turn as well. We were talking about, how Tommy hadn't really looked like a puncher in his last few fights. He had that confidence back up. He found his punch again. He took out Duran quickly. And then all of a sudden, those fights are completely forgotten. And you kind of remember him as, oh yeah, this is the guy who was beating Ray Leonard and up until he ran out of steam. And, now that he's put everything right, maybe he's unbeatable. Ray probably needs to just stay away from the sport because he dodged a bullet first time and he really doesn't need to be getting back in there with him. And, Hagler's getting on years, so he probably is in for a world of trouble if he has to meet him as well.
So I know, Ray Leonard is still to come, but I do want to go over one more piece about him. So in the Roldan fight with Hagler that you were talking about earlier, there is a thought, and Sugar Ray will change his story seemingly, all the time. But there was a thought that it was during this fight that Sugar Ray was actually calling, that he noticed, that Hagler was looking older and slower and slowing down. Now, this was before the fight with Hearns, which was, which we'll talk about the next time, and was an absolute war. But people think that this is the fight with Roldan that gives Sugar Ray Leonard the idea that he could actually win a fight with Hagler soon because of the fact that he is getting slower and slower.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. It's just like Marvin was obviously coming, like he had the hardest road to become accepted as a star. It took him the longest to get there and get recognition, and because of that, people were quickest to pull him back down to earth when he had a little bit of an underwhelming performance. And he was coming off ones that against guys people thought he would just cruise through. He had a more difficult time, and there was some signs that maybe somebody could catch him, and whether it would be, Ray Leonard coming back, although I don't know how many people would have thought at the time, or, a Tommy Hearns moving up, he would, with Tommy in red hot form, it seemed like that's where they were going. But just to talk a little bit about Tommy, because, I think this is probably the night of his career, and, it probably plays a big part in his legacy, because you kind of have to look at this in connection with some of his other fights. This is the only fight he won in the whole Fabulous Four series, but if you put it next to like the close call against Leonard and the shootout with Hagler where he pushed him right to the limit for only a few rounds, but like it was anybody's fight for those few rounds, and you think this guy had the ability maybe to beat all of them on his day. I think Angelo Dundee said, if Tommy Hearns had raised balance, he would have been unbeatable. And maybe that's the case. Maybe, it's just small little differences that change how we see Tommy Hearns in relation to the other ones. Historically, as you said, he probably is the least well remembered of them. Not that he doesn't have a great legacy in his own right, he does. But out of the four guys, he's probably the one who's seen as a little bit below the others. But he showed in the first Leonard fight he was he could be every bit as good as Leonard, and he showed at this fight how dangerous he could be as well. So I think Tommy Hearns was right in the conversation with all those guys, even if the results didn't necessarily reflect that at the end of this series.
Yeah, and, he would go on to win the 1984 Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year. And that just leads us to our next episode, which is Hagler and Hearns. I think there are three fights that are probably the most well remembered of the series, and that is probably the no Moss fight, Hagler and Hearns, and then Hagler and Leonard. So this is a big one coming up.
Yeah, it's been called the fight. It's been called the war. But what it was Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns in 8 Minutes of Mayhem. That's April 15, 1985, back at Caesars.
And that's where we will leave you. This is probably the shortest of all of our podcasts, but it was also the shortest fight of the series. And maybe, and this is sort of what I want to leave you with, you had mentioned that this may have been this is maybe Hearns' best shot of his entire career. This is probably the best single punch of the entire Fabulous Four series as well.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but yeah, it's I would say so. Obviously, Leonard had to dig in deep to get that stoppage against Tommy the first time. That was a great KO. Hearns' knockout of, or Hagler's knockout of Hearns that would come in the next fight. That was a great KO as well. But I don't think there was one better than this in that era.
So that's where we will catch back up the next time with the war, Tommy Hearns and Marvin Hagler. So I want to say thanks to Duan for co-hosting today. I am a Double G. We will see you when we see you. Peace out.